Welcome to the deep dive. You've handed us a fascinating stack of sources, primarily some really deep historical and cultural analysis necessary for understanding the Gospel of Matthew.
That's right. And if you're joining us today expecting just a simple recap, well, you're going to be surprised. Our mission here is to take this 2,000-year-old text and really try to reread it through the eyes of the people it was originally for.
Which means we are immediately diving into the deep end. Because what we learn is that Matthew's original purpose completely changes the meaning of almost every famous story we think we know.
Absolutely. Matthew was written for a very specific audience, a Jewish audience, and its purpose was twofold, and these 2 points, they really define the entire book. First, it had to prove, beyond any doubt, that Jesus was the long-awaited Messiah.
Okay, that makes sense. That's the core claim of Christianity.
But the second purpose is the part that I think modern readers often miss entirely. Matthew was also an immediate and radical critique. I mean, it was a public document designed to correct what the early church saw as fundamental, dangerous theological errors that had just completely overtaken Judaism at the time.
So what you're saying is the miracles aren't just sweet stories of healing.
Right.
They're actually acts of confrontation. They are less about showing off power and more about issuing an accusation almost against a religious system that had become corrupt and, well, cruel.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Okay, so let's unpack this, starting with how Matthew tried to convince his audience right out of the gate.
The text itself starts with a structure that is clearly intentional. I mean, we have the genealogy divided into 3 very precise sections of 14 generations each. Then Jesus' teachings are organized into 5 major sermons. It's methodical, almost mathematical.
It had to be. Matthew was writing for an audience that valued structure, history, lineage. They weren't looking for some abstract spiritual leader. They were waiting for a specific, identifiable figure who fulfilled centuries of prophecy.
And we read that opening line today, Abraham and David's son, Jesus Christ. And honestly, it just sounds like a formal listing of ancestors, like reading the opening credits of a movie.
And that's exactly the contextual trap. You are correct. It sounds like he's just listing relatives to establish historical credibility. But here is the critical key that makes the whole book fall into place for the first century reader. At the time Matthew was written, the phrase son of David was not just a lineage marker.
What was it?
It was a job title.
Wait, like a synonym?
Yes. For a Jewish audience, hearing son of David was completely synonymous with hearing the word Messiah. It was an interchangeable term. If you don't know that background, you miss the entire foundational claim immediately. Matthew isn't easing into his argument, he is front-loading the declaration. This is the one.
Wow. So the whole conversation, the argument for why Jesus matters is lost if you treat Son of David as just, a historical note.
Exactly. So without that single historical nugget, the most vital foundational claim of the gospel becomes completely unintelligible to the modern reader.
And once he establishes that the Messiah has arrived, he immediately pivots.
He does. He pivots to the core errors that this Messiah found in place.
Okay, let's look at the first and maybe the most destructive error Matthew challenged, the doctrine of retribution. This was, at the time, the theological bedrock. If you suffer, it is because you sinned. Suffering is proof of guilt.
Right. And we have to trace the history here a bit, because this shift took centuries. The doctrine started with a legitimate basis during the Babylonian exile. The prophets taught that breaking the covenant led to national communal punishment, losing the promised land.
So a consequence for the whole community, a national failure.
A national failure, right. But over hundreds of years, that powerful communal belief, it mutated. It shifted, subtly but dangerously, from communal failure to individual personal guilt. And once that shift happens, any form of suffering becomes proof of your personal sin against God.
That's just devastating. That means any hardship becomes evidence that God is judging you personally.
And think about the practical social consequences of that. Who falls into this judgment? Anyone with an incurable illness, anyone who suffers an accident, anyone living in poverty, or anyone who holds a low-status menial job. Your sources even point to cultural transgressions, like a woman just speaking to a man outside her immediate family, which would immediately mark her as a sinner.
That paints an awful picture. So under the system, the people labeled sinners, the sick, the poor, those who work tough jobs, they weren't some fringe group.
Not at all.
They were the absolute majority of the population.
They were. The group they call the righteous were a very small, privileged minority. Healthy, wealthy, and high status. And this changes everything about how we read Jesus' ministry. We often interpret the healing miracles as primarily demonstrations of divine love and power.
Which they were, I guess, secondarily.
Yes, but their primary purpose was far more radical. Jesus' healing miracles were direct, public acts of dismantling the retribution doctrine. By consistently associating with and healing these outcasts, the people judged and condemned by the religious system. Jesus was making a profound public statement. These people are not being punished by God. They are God's children, and God is not just a judge, but their Abba.
The intimate term for father, he was effectively saving them from a religion that had already sentenced them to be outcasts.
And we see the ultimate cruelty of this doctrine in the parable of the Good Samaritan. When we read it today, we instinctively think the priest and the Levite passed by the injured man because, they lacked compassion or were in a hurry.
That's certainly the standard modern interpretation, a simple failure of empathy.
But the contextual truth is far more complex and, frankly, horrifying. The priest and Levite passed by the man because, according to their core doctrine, he was suffering God's punishment. They believe he must have committed some sin to deserve being attacked by robbers.
Wait, so if they helped him, they would be seen as, what, challenging God?
Exactly. They would have been seen as interfering with divine justice. Imagine if you saw a teacher punishing a student and you, a bystander, stepped in. You'd be disrespecting the teacher's authority. In their minds, helping the injured man meant standing against God's judgment.
Wow, so the parable isn't just about kindness, it's a direct indictment. It points out the moral absurdity and the cold, institutionalized cruelty of their system, contrasted with the simple humanity of the Samaritan, who didn't follow that corrupt theology.
The point is, look at how twisted your theological framework has become, where cruelty is considered obedience to God.
So if Jesus challenged the social system through healing, where did he turn next? It seems like he turned to the laws governing daily life, specifically the Sabbath. Let's shift to the second major error Matthew highlights, the extreme interpretation of the Sabbath law.
This started, innocently enough, as a defensive measure. The law included 39 prohibitions on labor. It was intended to counter the influence of Hellenistic culture, to keep Jews from going to Greek theaters or stadiums on the holy day.
So the rule was designed to protect their culture and identity.
Yes. And that led to things like the travel limit. They limited travel to about 2 kilometers, which was the maximum distance to the local synagogue. It was practical. Go to the synagogue, don't go to the stadium. But over time, that defensive measure morphed into legalistic absurdity.
And your sources provide some fascinating, almost comical examples of how rigorously this is enforced even today.
Oh, absolutely. The rigor is astounding. We see discussions around not being allowed to press an elevator button because that's an act of labor. This led to special elevators that stop at every single floor, but even those were later ruled against by some authorities who said they were too convenient and therefore violated the spirit of the law.
The logic loop is just dizzying.
But the most shocking example in the source materials concerns human life. They detail situations where individuals were forbidden from turning on a tripped circuit breaker, even in a hospital or a home, where someone needed critical medical equipment.
Because resetting the breaker was work.
Right. The rule had become demonstrably more important than preserving human life itself.
That explains why Jesus was so intentional about this.
Exactly. The source confirms that Jesus never missed an opportunity to heal someone on the Sabbath. This wasn't accidental scheduling. It was a deliberate public challenge to the rigidity of the system. It was a confrontation.
And his defense was pretty direct.
Very direct. He'd say, "My Father is working and I am working." And he would ask these rhetorical questions like, is it lawful to do good on the Sabbath or to do harm? His core critique was revolutionary. The Sabbath was made for man, not man for the Sabbath. He was trying to recenter the law on human need and dignity, not on rules that crushed people.
Okay, moving to the final and perhaps most enduring correction in Matthew, the critique of sacred space. The Gospels challenge the religious system's obsessive focus on the physical temple, the sanctuary, and all this elaborate, costly worship.
And this carries a devastating historical truth that goes far beyond first-century Jerusalem. If we look across human history, the pursuit of building a magnificent house of God, a physical structure for God's presence, has often been a top factor leading to human misery and exploitation.
Because the logic demands that if it's God's house, it has to be the greatest, the biggest, the most expensive.
Precisely. It requires the highest architectural and artistic standards. Stained glass, massive domes, gold plating, but the cost is always immense. It requires vast sums of money, which historically means non-voluntary offerings, taxes, or even conquest, and massive labor forces.
And the sources detail the terrible historical consequences of that ambition.
Absolutely. To finance these projects, religious leaders might invade neighboring nations for resources or institute systems of enslavement and forced labor. Just think of the European cathedrals that often took 500, 700 years to complete. This ambition almost always led to institutional corruption.
The construction of St. Peter's Basilica is the perfect example, right?
Yes. The Vatican's immense project was partly funded by selling indulgences, a practice where you could literally pay for forgiveness. The financial demand of the physical structure completely corrupted the theology it was meant to serve. The building became more important than the people.
And that desire for elaborate worship spills over into everything, linking this historical critique directly to modern religious practice.
The sources are very clear on this. Think about developing complex musical pieces or massive instruments like the pipe organ. These things cost vast sums to create and maintain.
And this demand can crush the very artists involved.
Right. Even composers like Mozart, who were essentially controlled labor for the church, were like musical slaves dedicated to producing elaborate worship. And we see it today in the focus on costly aesthetics, like weekly expensive fresh flower arrangements, when simple, reusable items would do. The logic is, if it's for God, it must be the most expensive, even if it hurts people.
So Jesus' ultimate statement against this, the warning that not one stone will be left upon another, it wasn't just a prediction.
No, it was a profound condemnation. Just as the Old Testament prophets cried out to tear down the temple, Jesus was condemning a system where the physical building and its rituals had become an idol, an oppressive force that crushed people. He was saying, the true temple is not made of stone.
This deep dive gives us an entirely new framework. We've moved from a traditional reading to understanding Matthew's original mission, proving the Messiah while simultaneously correcting three major fatal errors that had crippled first-century Judaism.
We've established that those three core errors were, first, the true identity of Jesus, which is missed unless we understand Son of David means Messiah. Second, the institutional cruelty of the retribution doctrine. And third, the absurdity and exploitation inherent in legalistic ritual and sanctuary worship.
The profound difference between the modern, almost sanitized interpretation and the original aggressive context is just astonishing.
And this leads us to the definitive conclusion. To correctly interpret the Bible, or any text rooted in antiquity, you must absolutely understand the historical, social, and cultural background of the time. If you try to interpret it without that 2,000-year-old context, your understanding is guaranteed to be flawed.
This deep dive shows us that Jesus' first mission wasn't just saving individuals from sin, but fundamentally saving people from a broken and cruel form of religion. We're left to wonder, what core assumptions of our own modern beliefs about who is worthy or where resources should go might be similarly rooted in centuries of slow, unchecked change blinding us to fundamental truths today? That's something for you to mull or explore on your own.